My wife, to be a high-powered CEO, slammed a prenup on the dinner table and declared she would not risk her future on a retired postal worker like me. I just nodded, told her it was smart thinking, and quietly had my lawyer draft a document that protected the empire I had built in secret. When her legal team realized my assets were 20 times larger than hers, the panic in their eyes was priceless. But before I tell you exactly how I dismantled her arrogant world piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe respect should never carry a price tag. My name is Tyrone. I am 69 years old, and this is the night my family showed me their true colors. The air in Valerie's minimalist glass dining room was already suffocating before the real disrespect began. We were gathered to discuss the final details of our upcoming wedding. The catered salmon was barely touched when Valerie, sitting at the head of the table like a queen addressing her subjects, reached into her designer bag. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and dropped it onto the glass table with a loud thud. The sound echoed in the quiet room. She looked at me with a perfectly manicured smile that did not reach her eyes. "I want a prenuptial agreement, Tyrone," she declared, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am a CEO. I have spent decades building my marketing firm. You are a retired postal worker living on a fixed income. I love you, but I am not risking my financial future on you." The silence that followed her declaration was heavy, but it did not last long. Megan, the white woman married to Valerie's son Jameson, let out a short, mocking laugh. She adjusted her diamond necklace and looked me up and down with undisguised contempt. "Let us be honest here, Tyrone," Megan sneered, her voice dripping with privilege. "You are wearing a flannel shirt with a frayed collar to a wedding planning dinner. Valerie is just protecting her assets from becoming your retirement fund. It is just common sense." Next to her, Connor, Valerie's white son-in-law and the chief financial officer of her company, swirled his expensive red wine and joined the ambush. Connor always carried himself with an unearned arrogance. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Megan has a point," old man Connor said, completely dropping any pretense of respect. "You bring absolutely nothing to the table financially. A federal pension might buy your groceries, but it does not maintain this lifestyle. You should be grateful Valerie is even keeping you around." The sheer audacity of these two outsiders insulting me was infuriating, but what truly cut me to the core was the reaction of my own flesh and blood. My son Deshaun sat directly across from me. I had raised Deshaun by myself after his mother passed away. I worked double shifts to put him through college. Instead of defending me, Deshaun shifted uncomfortably in his chair, eager to please the wealthy family he so desperately wanted to belong to. "Dad, just sign the papers," Deshaun demanded, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Do not make this difficult. Valerie is being more than generous by including you in her life." "Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for me to have to explain your financial situation to my colleagues? You live in a tiny rundown house and drive a truck from the 90s. Signing this document is the least you can do to prove you are not a gold digger." Deshaun glared at me, his eyes devoid of the affection we once shared. He had traded his loyalty to me for a chance to climb Valerie's corporate ladder. The united front was clear. Valerie sat back, clearly enjoying the way her family and my own son were putting me in my place. They viewed me as a beggar, fortunate enough to be invited to the feast. I looked at the faces staring back at me. A storm of rage and sorrow raged inside my chest, but I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. Deshaun's betrayal was a knife twisting in my gut. I had sacrificed my youth so he could have a future, and here he was auctioning off my dignity for a scrap of approval from arrogant strangers. But I am a man who learned long ago that reacting with anger only gives your enemies power. I had built a massive real estate and logistics empire entirely in secret. I lived a quiet, modest life by choice, wearing simple clothes and driving an old truck to avoid exactly this kind of superficial greed. I maintained a stoic facade, letting them believe their cruel words had hit their mark. I breathed slowly, calculating my next move. I reached out and rested my hand on the thick stack of legal papers. "Smart thinking, Valerie," I said, my voice steady and perfectly calm. "I completely understand your need to protect what belongs to you. You have worked hard. I will have my lawyer review this and I will sign it." Valerie's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by how easily I surrendered. Connor scoffed softly, shaking his head as if my submission was pathetic. Deshaun let out a loud sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair as if he had just successfully managed a troublesome child. But Valerie was a woman who fed on total domination. Simply getting me to agree was not enough for her ego. She needed to push me further down to ensure I knew my place. "Well, I am glad you are finally being realistic, Tyrone," Valerie said, folding her hands neatly on the glass table. "Since we are being practical about finances, there is one more condition before we finalize this wedding." I raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The venue we chose for the reception is a 5-star luxury hotel downtown." She continued, her tone brisk and transactional. "It is very expensive, and quite frankly, my company capital is currently tied up in some large investments. I expect you to contribute your fair share to this wedding. I want you to sell that small, outdated house of yours. The land alone should cover your half of the wedding expenses. You can move in here with me permanently." Megan smirked again, taking a sip of her champagne. "It is a win-win, Tyrone. You get to live in a mansion, and Valerie gets the wedding she deserves without bearing all the financial burden of your inclusion." Connor chuckled, tapping his expensive watch. "Consider it your entry fee to high society, old man. Your property is an eyesore anyway. Selling it is doing the neighborhood a massive favor. They were openly demanding I surrender my only visible asset, my home, to fund a lavish party designed solely to stroke Valerie's ego. That house was where I had lived for 30 years. It was modest, yes, but it was mine. Valerie knew exactly what she was asking. She wanted to strip away my last shred of independence, so I would be entirely reliant on her charity. If I sold the house and signed the prenup, I would essentially become her property, easily discarded, without a dime to my name, if she ever grew tired of me. She looked at me with an expectant, challenging glare, daring me to refuse and ruin the wedding plans. I looked around the table, taking in their arrogant, expectant faces. They thought they had backed a helpless old man into a corner. They thought I was a pathetic, dependent fool desperate for their validation. Instead of arguing, I let a warm, agreeable smile spread across my face. "You are absolutely right, Valerie," I said smoothly. "It is only fair that I pull my own weight for our special day. I will contact a real estate agent tomorrow and get the house appraised for a quick sale." Valerie beamed with triumph while Deshawn nodded in vigorous approval. They raised their glasses to toast their victory. They had no idea they had just handed me the shovel I would use to bury them. The silent adjustment had officially begun. 2 days later, a courier knocked on my front door and handed me a thick sealed envelope bearing the logo of Valerie's high-priced legal team. I took it to my modest kitchen table, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and opened the document. The prenuptial agreement was 50 pages of absolute financial ruthlessness. Her lawyers had drafted a contract designed not just to protect her, but to completely subjugate me. I read through the clauses with a calm, analytical eye. If our marriage ended, I would leave with exactly what I brought in, waiving any right to alimony or spousal support. But the audacity did not stop there. The contract stipulated that during our marriage, I would be required to pay a monthly fee of $3,000 to cover my share of the utilities and maintenance at her estate. In plain terms, she was going to charge me rent to be her husband. I was also responsible for my own medical insurance and vehicle expenses. It was a predatory contract meant to ensure I remained utterly dependent and financially crippled while elevating her status. My phone buzzed against the table. The screen displayed Valerie's name. I answered, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Valerie did not bother with a greeting. She jumped straight to business, her tone brimming with smug satisfaction. "I assume you received the package, Tyrone," she said smoothly. "I did," I replied. "I am looking over the terms right now." Valerie let out a soft, condescending chuckle. "Do not overwhelm yourself trying to understand all the legal jargon. It is just standard corporate procedure. Connor and my legal team handled the heavy lifting. They made sure the wording is airtight so neither of us has to worry about any messy financial entanglements later." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Airtight is certainly one word for it," I noted. "You are requiring me to pay rent to live in your house." Valerie scoffed as if my observation was incredibly naive. "Well, Tyrone partnership means contributing. I cannot be expected to carry the entire financial weight of our household just because your federal pension is limited. Megan and Jameson agree with me. They think it is healthy for you to have some skin in the game. It preserves your dignity. You should be thanking me for not treating you like a complete charity case. Besides, once you sell that little shack of yours, you will have plenty of cash to cover your monthly contributions and pay for the wedding venue. Speaking of which, the wedding planner needs a $50,000 deposit by the end of the month. I expect you to list your property this week. The market is hot, and you really cannot afford to drag your feet on this. Connor even offered to recommend a discount real estate agent for you, since you probably do not know anyone in the commercial sector." I listened to her gloat, absorbing every ounce of her arrogance. She was treating my life, my home, and my dignity as mere stepping stones for her vanity. She wanted me to feel small, desperate, and grateful for the leash she was tightening around my neck. "I will get the appraisal done immediately," I assured her, my voice betraying zero emotion. "I want everything to be perfectly in order for our future." "Outstanding," she purred, practically vibrating with victory. "Have a quiet afternoon, Tyrone. I have a board meeting to run." She hung up, leaving me in the silence of my kitchen. I set the phone down and looked around the faded wallpaper of my living room. Valerie saw poverty when she looked at this house. I saw the foundation of an empire. 40 years ago, my late wife and I bought this property when we had nothing but big dreams and empty pockets. We started with a single-use delivery box truck. We worked grueling hours, reinvested every dime, and slowly built a massive logistics and commercial real estate network spanning the entire East Coast. When she passed away, I realized how quickly money attracts parasites. I chose to stay in our original home, driving my old truck, wearing simple clothes, and managing my holding companies entirely from the shadows. True power does not need to wear a designer suit or boast at dinner parties. I had wealth that could buy Valerie's entire corporate building 10 times over, but I preferred the peace of being underestimated. Valerie and her family of vultures thought they were dealing with a broke retired postal worker. They were actually trying to extort a silent billionaire. I gathered the prenuptial agreement, slid it into a plain leather briefcase, and drove downtown. I did not go to a discount legal clinic. I walked into the most exclusive law firm in the city, taking the private elevator to the top floor. Jonathan Miller, my personal attorney and wealth manager for the last 15 years, greeted me with a firm handshake. Jonathan was a sharp, meticulous man of 60 who knew exactly how much power I wielded. I sat across from his mahogany desk and handed him Valerie's contract. Jonathan put on his reading glasses and scanned the pages. Within 2 minutes, his face contorted in absolute disgust. "Tyrone, this is insulting," Jonathan stated, tossing the packet onto his desk. "This contract is highly predatory. She is completely fencing you out of any marital assets while forcing you to drain your own limited resources to subsidize her lifestyle. I can tear this apart in court, or better yet, we can counter with terms that actually protect you." I shook my head, leaning back in the plush leather chair. "I do not want you to fight a single clause, Jonathan. I want to sign it exactly as it is written." Jonathan stared at me, deeply confused. "You want to agree to this?" "Yes," I replied smoothly. "The contract clearly states that what is hers remains hers and what is mine remains mine. It protects our independent assets from each other completely. It is a brilliant strategy on her part." Jonathan narrowed his eyes, catching on to my tone. "But legally, if you sign this, we are required to attach a Schedule A document, a full and completely transparent declaration of your true net worth. You cannot hide your assets on a legal prenup." I smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "I know. I want you to draft the Schedule A, list every holding company, every commercial property, the logistics fleet, and all my investment portfolios. Attach it to the back of her precious contract and send it directly to her lawyers." A slow, predatory grin spread across Jonathan's face as he realized the magnitude of my trap. "While I will gladly prepare the asset declaration, there is something else you need to see," Jonathan said, turning his computer monitor toward me. "When you told me about the wedding, I ran a quiet background check on Valerie's company and her chief financial officer, Connor. I always like to know who my clients are getting into bed with." Jonathan tapped a few keys, bringing up a complex financial spreadsheet. "Valerie has been projecting the image of a highly successful CEO, but her company is drowning. They are currently carrying a massive hidden debt. Connor has been cooking the books to hide the deficit from their investors. Valerie is not just arrogant, Tyrone. She is desperate, and her entire empire is standing on the edge of a massive cliff." I leaned closer to the monitor as Jonathan pointed to the red lines bleeding across the financial statements. $5 million. "Tyrone," Jonathan said, his tone dead serious, leaving no room for doubt. "That is the exact amount Valerie's marketing firm is currently bleeding. They are over-leveraged on 3 major commercial leases and have defaulted on 2 vital vendor contracts." I studied the numbers, tracing the origin of the collapse. "And Connor?" I asked. Jonathan tapped the screen. "Connor is the architect of this disaster. As chief financial officer, he diverted company funds into a series of high-risk offshore tech startups that completely tanked. To hide the deficit from Valerie's board of directors, he has been cooking the books, shuffling money between shell accounts to make the company look profitable. The illusion of Valerie's grand empire shattered instantly. She was not a titan of industry. She was the captain of a sinking ship. Early the next morning, the roar of a heavy diesel engine shattered the peace of my quiet neighborhood. I stepped out onto my front porch holding my coffee mug. A massive yellow bulldozer was idling right at the edge of my property line. Parked directly behind it was a sleek silver luxury SUV. The doors swung open and Jameson stepped out wearing a tailored suit that looked entirely out of place on my modest street. Megan climbed out of the passenger side holding an iced coffee and looking at my home with absolute disgust. She pinched her nose as if the very air around my property was contaminated. 3 men in hard hats and neon vests walked up behind them, carrying sledgehammers and measuring tape. "All right, guys, let us start with the chain link fence," Jameson shouted over the engine noise, clapping his hands together like a foreman. "Tear it all down. We need to clear the perimeter to maximize curb appeal. The real estate photographer will be here by noon." I walked down the steps of my porch, my boots crunching against the gravel. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through the morning air. "What exactly do you think you are doing on my property?" Megan rolled her eyes and took a loud sip from her plastic cup. "Oh, Tyrone, please do not make a scene. Valerie told you to get this dump ready for the market. We are just speeding up the process." Jameson gestured to the contractors to keep moving. "Valerie wants this plot listed by tomorrow morning. The fence is hideous and the yard looks like a junkyard. We hired a rapid flip crew to bulldoze the exterior and lay down some fresh sod. Do not worry, we will just bill the construction costs to your share of the wedding venue." One of the contractors raised a sledgehammer and approached my front gate. "You do not have the authority to touch a single blade of grass on this land," I warned them, stepping directly into the path of the bulldozer. Megan scoffed loudly, stepping closer with a vicious smirk. "Tyrone, this moldy little shack is a complete embarrassment. Do you honestly think anyone wants to buy a property that smells like old boots and cheap grease? We are doing you a massive favor. Valerie is practically carrying you into high society, so the least you can do is cooperate and let the professionals fix your mess." Jameson checked his luxury watch. "Stand aside, Tyrone. We have a tight schedule and Connor needs the appraisal numbers by 3 o'clock today." Hearing Connor's name slip from Jameson's mouth was the final piece of the puzzle locking perfectly into place. I stared at the bulldozer, then at the frantic, aggressive energy radiating from Jameson and Megan. This was not about funding a luxury wedding reception at a 5-star hotel downtown. This was a desperate, calculated cash grab. My modest house sat on a prime half-acre corner lot that had recently been rezoned for highly lucrative commercial development. The land alone was worth nearly $1 million to the right corporate buyer. Valerie and Connor did not care about my property's curb appeal. They needed my land liquidated immediately to inject emergency cash into their failing business. They were trying to steal my home to patch the $5 million hole Connor had blasted into their company ledger. The sheer predatory nature of their plan was staggering. I did not raise my voice, but the cold authority in my tone made the lead contractor freeze with his sledgehammer midair. "Put the hammer down," I commanded, locking eyes with the man in the hard hat. "If that metal touches my fence, I will have you arrested for trespassing and destruction of private property. I own this land outright and I have not signed a single work order." The contractor lowered his tool, looking uncertainly between me and Jameson. Jameson's face flushed with intense anger. "Hey, I hired you, get to work!" he yelled at the crew. I stepped right up to Jameson, completely invading his personal space. I am 6 feet 2 inches tall, and decades of hard manual labor had built a physical presence that no tailored suit could intimidate. "You hired them to vandalize property you do not own," I stated, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "This is my house. You are trespassing." I turned to the crew. "You have exactly 10 seconds to back that bulldozer off my curb before I call the police and press charges against your company." The lead contractor did not hesitate. He signaled his men, and they immediately began backing the heavy machinery away from my fence. Jameson lunged forward, his face contorted in rage. "You cannot do this, Tyrone. We have a strict timeline. Valerie is going to be furious." I grabbed Jameson by the lapel of his expensive jacket, gripping the fabric tightly enough to let him feel my physical strength. I hauled him backward, shoving him stumbling toward his luxury SUV. "Get off my property," I warned him, my eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Do not ever step foot on my land again unless you have an invitation, and you will never get one." Jameson caught his balance against the hood of his vehicle, his eyes wide with genuine shock. He had expected a weak, submissive old man who would roll over at the first sign of authority. Instead, he found a man who refused to be bullied by entitled children. I pointed my finger directly at his chest. "Take your wife and get off my driveway right now." Megan's face turned bright red, her privileged composure completely shattering under the weight of my defiance. "You are completely insane," she shrieked, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me. "You are just a broke, pathetic loser. Valerie is going to hear about this immediately. She will cancel the wedding. You are going to die alone in this rotting shack." I stood my ground on the porch, completely unbothered by her hysterical outburst. "Tell Valerie whatever you want," I replied smoothly. "And make sure you tell Connor to check his math." I turned my back on them, walked up my front steps and went inside. I shut the heavy wooden door behind me and locked the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click, leaving them screaming on the sidewalk as their entire financial lifeline vanished. The sound of my front door splintering inward shattered the quiet of my living room. I turned just in time to see the heavy oak frame crack as Deshaun forcefully kicked it open. He stormed inside, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Deshaun was dressed in a sharp designer suit, looking every bit the corporate climber he desperately wanted to be, but his behavior was nothing short of thuggish. He slammed the broken door shut behind him, the impact rattling the picture frames on the walls. "You old fool," Deshaun bellowed, his voice echoing in the small space. I stood completely still, watching my own son bring the chaotic energy of Valerie's family into the sanctuary I had built for us. He marched right up to me, invading my personal space, his eyes wide and wild. "Megan just called me screaming her head off. She said you physically assaulted Jameson and threatened her." Deshaun pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "Are you actively trying to destroy my life? Because you are doing a fantastic job of it." I did not flinch. I kept my hands relaxed by my sides, a stark contrast to his aggressive posture. "I did not lay a hand on anyone," I replied evenly. "They brought a bulldozer to tear down my fence without my permission. I simply told them to leave." Deshaun threw his hands up in exasperation, pacing the floor like a caged animal. "Who cares about your stupid fence?" he yelled, spittle flying from his lips. "You live in a worthless dump. Valerie is offering you a way out, a chance to actually be somebody, and you are acting like a stubborn, ungrateful beggar. You have embarrassed me in front of Connor and the entire executive board. Do you have any idea how much damage control I have to do now?" Deshaun stopped pacing and glared at me, his expression hardening into something cold and calculated. "You need to fix this right now," he demanded, his tone dropping to a sharp, authoritative order. "You are going to sign the property over to Valerie's LLC today. And then, you are going to cash out your entire federal retirement pension." I stared at him, genuinely stunned by the sheer audacity of his demand. "My retirement?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, your retirement." Deshaun snapped back, entirely missing the warning in my tone. "Connor's new tech initiative is facing a minor cash flow hiccup. He needs an immediate capital injection to secure the next round of investor funding. If you liquidate your pension, we can bridge the gap. Connor promised me a vice president title and equity in the new startup if I can secure the bridge loan. This is my chance to be a real player, not just a junior executive. You have done nothing with your life. You delivered mail for 40 years and ended up with nothing but a crumbling house. You owe me this. Liquidate the pension sign over the house and let me actually build a legacy." The heartbreak I felt in that moment was profound, a deep, hollow ache in the center of my chest. I looked at Deshaun, searching for any trace of the son I had raised, the boy who used to help me change the oil in my old truck, the young man I had sacrificed everything for. I found nothing. The person standing before me was a stranger infected by the toxic greed of Valerie and Connor. He had completely absorbed their worldview, viewing people solely as resources to be exploited. He did not care if I ended up homeless and destitute on the street as long as it bought him a shiny new title in a failing company. He had chosen the hollow promise of wealth and status over his own father. The betrayal was absolute. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the sorrow wash over me and harden into resolve. "No," I said, my voice resolute, lacking any trace of hesitation. Deshaun blinked clearly, not expecting a direct refusal. "What do you mean, no?" he stammered, his anger flaring up again. "I mean exactly what I said," I replied, my gaze locked onto his. "I am not selling my house, and I am absolutely not handing over my pension to fund Connor's fraudulent schemes." Deshawn's face contorted in fury. "You are pathetic," he spat, stepping back toward the broken door. "You have always been a loser, content to be nobody. I am done with you. If you will not help me, then you are not my father anymore. Consider this my resignation from whatever family we had. Valerie is my family now. Connor is my family now. They actually understand ambition. Do not ever contact me again." He turned on his heel, marched out the door, and slammed his way into his luxury car. I watched him peel out of the driveway, the tires screeching loudly, leaving black marks on the asphalt. The silence that followed was heavy, but I did not let myself dwell on the pain. The line had been drawn. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Jonathan's direct line. Jonathan answered immediately. "Tyrone, what is the situation?" I watched the dust settle in the street. "Jonathan, I need you to initiate a total freeze on the primary trust fund holding Deshawn's name. Cut off his access to the backup credit lines and remove him as a secondary signatory on the real estate LLCs. He is officially cut off." "Understood, Tyrone," Jonathan replied smoothly. "The freeze will be active within the hour." I hung up, staring at the empty street. The silent adjustment was accelerating. The invitation to Valerie's annual corporate gala arrived with a strict dress code, but I ignored it completely. I walked into the grand ballroom of the Sapphire Hotel wearing a clean-pressed but noticeably off-the-rack charcoal suit I had owned for a decade. The room was a sea of glittering chandeliers, custom tuxedos, and flowing silk gowns. Waiters glided silently across the polished marble floors carrying trays of expensive champagne. The atmosphere reeked of manufactured exclusivity. Valerie had insisted I attend to prove I was committed to blending into her world, despite the tension of the past few days. I knew exactly why she wanted me there. I was not a guest of honor. I was a prop. I navigated through the crowd of high society elites, my simple attire drawing immediate judgmental stares from the wealthy attendees who viewed my presence as an aesthetic insult to their lavish environment. I found Valerie holding court near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a tight circle of her top investors and board members. She wore a stunning emerald green dress, diamonds glittering at her throat, projecting the absolute image of corporate dominance. Megan and Connor stood right beside her, holding crystal flutes and laughing at a joke I could not hear. Deshawn was hovering on the periphery of their circle, eagerly nodding along like a desperate subordinate. When Valerie spotted me approaching, her smile sharpened into a weapon. She did not greet me with warmth. Instead, she turned to her wealthy colleagues and gestured toward me with a manicured hand. "Everyone I would like you to meet, Tyrone," Valerie announced, her voice pitched loud enough to carry over the ambient music. "He is a retired postal worker. I suppose you could call him my personal charity project. I am trying to teach him how the other half lives, though it is quite the uphill battle, as you can see by his outdated wardrobe. We have to be patient with those who lack our refined background." The investors chuckled politely, exchanging amused, condescending glances. Megan leaned in and whispered something to a board member, causing the woman to cover her mouth to hide a laugh. Deshawn simply looked away, refusing to make eye contact with me, deeply ashamed of his own father. Connor, however, decided that verbal humiliation was not enough. He stepped forward, a full glass of dark red wine in his right hand. He looked me up and down, his face twisted in a smug, superior sneer. Connor deliberately stumbled, thrusting his arm forward and splashing the entire glass of deep crimson wine directly onto my light gray shirt and charcoal jacket. The cold liquid soaked through to my skin, instantly leaving a massive dark stain across my chest. The glass did not break, but the damage was profoundly visible. "Oh, my deepest apologies, Tyrone," Connor said loudly, his tone dripping with thick theatrical sarcasm. "I did not see you standing there. You blend right in with the catering staff. But then again, even the wait staff here can afford tailored jackets that do not look like they were pulled from a donation bin. You really should not have come here dressed like a vagrant. It reflects poorly on Valerie's brand." Connor reached into the pocket of his custom tuxedo, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and flicked it dismissively at my chest. The bill fluttered down, landing on my wine-soaked shoe. "Go buy yourself a clean shirt from a discount rack, old man," Connor sneered. "You are ruining the aesthetic of our corporate milestone." Valerie did not reprimand him. She simply sighed dramatically, playing the role of the embarrassed benefactor. "Really, Tyrone," she scolded, "you are making a complete mess." A ripple of cruel laughter echoed through the circle of executives. The board members Megan and even my own son stood by and watched a man be humiliated for their entertainment. Deshaun actually smiled, desperate to align himself with the bullies rather than defend his father. I looked around the glittering ballroom, taking in the absolute absurdity of the situation. Every single person laughing at me was tied to a company that was currently drowning in $5 million of hidden debt. They wore luxury watches, drove imported sports cars, and wore diamond necklaces bought on exorbitant credit, celebrating a corporate empire that was essentially a hollow, rotting shell. I had spent 40 years building real, tangible wealth. I owned commercial shipping fleets that moved goods across the country and real estate that generated massive, sustainable income. My wealth was built on concrete and steel, not on fragile egos and falsified financial ledgers. They thought my silence was the mark of a defeated, powerless old man. They did not understand that I was simply calculating the exact trajectory of their imminent destruction. A lion does not roar when it is preparing to strike. The laughter slowly died down as the group waited for my reaction. They expected me to shrink away in shame, to apologize for my clumsiness, or perhaps to lose my temper and validate their belief that I was an uncultured brute. I did none of those things. I stood perfectly straight, completely ignoring the wine dripping from my ruined jacket and soaking into my shirt. I did not break eye contact with Connor. I slowly bent down and picked up the $20 bill Connor had thrown at my feet. I brushed a speck of dust off the paper, folded it neatly with deliberate precision, and slipped it into my trousers pocket. "Thank you for the generous contribution, Connor," I said, my voice incredibly calm, resonant, and devoid of any anger or embarrassment. "Every single dollar counts when you are desperately trying to balance a failing ledger." Connor frowned, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second, unable to comprehend why I was not breaking down or storming off in tears. His brow furrowed as my words registered, though he did not fully understand the threat behind them yet. I shifted my gaze to Valerie. She looked unnerved by my absolute stillness. The triumphant glow in her eyes began to dim, replaced by a flicker of cold uncertainty. "I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening," I stated smoothly, addressing the entire circle of executives. It is always fascinating to see how the other half lives, especially right before the bill comes due. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on Valerie, Connor, Megan, and my betrayer of a son. I walked toward the grand exit of the ballroom with slow, measured steps. My head was held high. I did not rush. I walked with the unshakable dignity of a man who owned the very ground they thought they ruled. The crowd parted for me instinctively, the sheer force of my composure demanding the respect they had just tried to strip away. I stepped out into the cool, crisp night air, leaving the noise and the blinding lights of the gala behind me. The valet brought my beat-up truck to the front curb, looking slightly confused by my wine-stained clothes. I handed him a generous tip, climbed into the driver's seat, and shut the heavy metal door. The silence inside the cabin was perfect. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened a secure messaging channel directly to Jonathan Miller. My fingers moved swiftly across the screen. I typed a single definitive command: "Buy Valerie's $5 million corporate debt tonight." I hit send, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. The execution of their empire had just been authorized. The chrome and glass conference room at Sterling and Vanguard, Valerie's elite legal representation, overlooked the entire city skyline. I sat at the far end of the massive mahogany table, dressed in my usual unassuming attire. Across from me sat Valerie, flanked by Connor and two corporate attorneys who looked like they had just stepped out of a high-fashion magazine. The lead attorney, a slick man with a sharp jawline and an even sharper suit, smiled condescendingly. He slid the thick prenuptial agreement across the polished wood toward me. The document landed with a heavy thud. "We have finalized the terms exactly as outlined," the attorney stated smoothly, steepling his fingers. "As Valerie requested, this contract ensures a total separation of assets. What she brings to the marriage remains hers, and your modest contributions will remain yours." He tapped the signature line with a gold-plated pen. "We just need your signature to make it legally binding and finalize the protective barriers around Valerie's corporate holdings." They looked at me like a lamb ready for the slaughter, completely oblivious to the trap they had just set for themselves. Valerie leaned forward, resting her elbows on the expensive table. She looked utterly radiant, practically glowing with the thrill of total control. "Before you pick up that pen, Tyrone, we need to address the immediate logistical matters," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "As we discussed, your financial obligations to this union begin today. My wedding planner requires the final deposit for the luxury venue by tomorrow morning. Connor has already done you the favor of contacting a rapid commercial buyer who is willing to take that crumbling house off your hands for a flat cash offer. It is slightly below market value, but given the condition of your property, it is a miracle anyone wants it at all. Connor smirked, adjusting his cuffs. Consider it a mercy buyout, Tyrone. We are streamlining the process so you do not have to navigate the complicated world of real estate. All you need to do is sign the property transfer deed over to our holding company right now. We will handle the demolition and the sale, and we will apply the funds directly to the wedding expenses and your first year of rent at Valerie's estate. You will not have to lift a finger. Valerie nodded approvingly at Connor's brutal summary. Exactly, she agreed. I brought the property transfer deed with me. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her designer bag and placed it next to the prenup. Sign the transfer deed first, Tyrone. Once the house is legally signed over to my LLC, we can proceed with the prenuptial agreement. This is the only way I can be absolutely certain you are committed to this marriage and not just looking for a free ride. Megan and Jameson were right about you needing to show some actual investment in our future. I looked at the property deed, then up at Valerie's expectant, greedy eyes. They were trying to legally strip me of my only known asset before I even signed the marriage contract. It was a masterclass in financial predation. They were so blinded by their own desperation to cover their $5 million corporate deficit that they did not even bother to hide their fangs anymore. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, resting my hands on my lap. I am afraid I cannot sign the transfer deed, Valerie, I replied evenly. Valerie's triumphant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a tight, furious scowl. Excuse me, she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. What do you mean you cannot sign it? We had an agreement, Tyrone. Do not try to back out now. Connor leaned forward aggressively. Listen here, old man, you do not have a choice. The buyer is waiting. Before Connor could finish his threat, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. Jonathan Miller strode into the room with absolute authority. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit and carried a sleek black leather briefcase. Sorry I am late, Tyrone, Jonathan said smoothly, taking the empty leather chair right beside me. Traffic was uncooperative, but I have the final documents prepared exactly as you requested. Valerie glared at Jonathan, then shot me a look of pure venom. Who is this? She demanded. I do not recall authorizing you to bring legal counsel to a simple signing. This is Jonathan Miller, my personal attorney and wealth manager, I stated calmly. And he is here because your prenuptial agreement requires a Schedule A document, a full and transparent declaration of my current assets. Valerie scoffed loudly. Your assets, please. A rundown house and a postal pension do not require a wealth manager. You are wasting our time. Jonathan ignored her completely. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick, meticulously bound document, and slid it across the table to Valerie's lead attorney. I highly recommend you review my client's asset declaration before we proceed, Jonathan advised, his tone dangerously polite. The lead attorney rolled his eyes, picking up the document with an air of profound boredom. He flipped to the summary page. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines. The color completely drained from his face. His arrogant smirk collapsed into an expression of absolute horror. He blinked rapidly, adjusting his glasses as if his vision had suddenly failed him. What is this? The attorney whispered, his voice trembling. Is this some kind of joke? It is a legally binding financial disclosure, Jonathan replied sharply. Valerie frowned, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. What is it? She demanded, reaching for the paper. Read it to me. The attorney swallowed hard, looking at me with newfound, terrified respect. According to this certified declaration, Mr. Tyrone's net worth includes full ownership of a massive East Coast logistics fleet, 26 commercial real estate properties, and a diversified investment portfolio. His total liquid and non-liquid assets exceed $120 million. The room plunged into a suffocating dead silence. Connor's jaw practically unhinged. Valerie froze her eyes, darting between me and her lawyer, unable to process the numbers. He is worth over 20 times more than your entire company's projected valuation. The attorney choked out the reality of the situation, crushing him. I did not say a word. I simply picked up the gold-plated pen Valerie had provided. I pulled the prenuptial agreement toward me. As you requested, Valerie, I said, my voice echoing in the dead quiet room. What is yours remains yours. and what is mine remains mine. I signed my name with a flourish, legally locking her out of my $120 million empire forever. I slid the signed contract back across the table. Valerie sat frozen in her chair, paralyzed by a shock so profound it seemed to stop her breathing. The blood had entirely vanished from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. Her eyes were fixed on my signature, staring at the ink as if it were a death warrant. She had spent the last month treating me like a worthless beggar plotting to steal my modest house to save her drowning company. Now the crushing realization washed over her. She had just aggressively forced a man worth over $100 million to sign a contract that completely blocked her from touching a single cent of his vast fortune. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The silent adjustment had struck its most devastating blow. The silence in the conference room broke with a sound that was half gasp, half scream. Valerie shot up from her chair, the legs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "Tear it up!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the prenuptial agreement I had just signed. "Tear that document up right now. It is invalid. This is fraud." Her lead attorney, still pale and sweating, did not move to grab the paper. He knew the law. He knew that the moment my pen left the page, the contract Valerie had painstakingly designed to protect her assets had instantly become an impenetrable fortress protecting mine. "You cannot do this!" Valerie yelled at me, her voice losing all its polished corporate sheen and dropping into raw, unfiltered panic. "You lied to me. You portrayed yourself as a retired postal worker." "I did not lie, Valerie," I replied smoothly, not moving from my chair. "I am retired from the Postal Service. I simply never mentioned what I did with my free time after my shifts ended." "You never asked. You just assumed. You looked at my clothes and my truck and decided you knew exactly who I was and exactly how much I was worth." Connor, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "This is a setup," he snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "You orchestrated this to humiliate her. You probably do not even have that money. Those documents are probably forged." Jonathan Miller let out a short, dry laugh. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a second, thinner folder. He tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid to a stop right in front of Valerie. "The asset declaration is fully certified, Connor," Jonathan said, his tone dripping with professional disdain. "But since you are so concerned with financial authenticity, perhaps you would like to authenticate the documents in that folder." Valerie stared at the new folder as if it were a bomb. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "That, Valerie, is the formal notification that as of 9 o'clock this morning, Vanguard Holdings, LLC officially acquired the entirety of your company's outstanding commercial debt." I watched the blood drain from Connor's face. The cocky, arrogant chief financial officer who had just thrown a $20 bill at me the night before looked like he was about to vomit. Valerie frowned, confusion warring with her mounting terror. "What debt? We do not have any outstanding debt. We are highly leveraged on a few marketing expansions, but our cash flow is solid. Connor, tell them they are lying." Connor did not speak. He stared fixedly at the mahogany table, a bead of sweat tracing its way down his temple. Jonathan did not wait for Connor to find his courage. He delivered the fatal blow with surgical precision. "Your company is currently carrying $5 million in toxic debt, Valerie. The marketing expansions you just mentioned were never funded. Your chief financial officer diverted that capital into a series of high-risk offshore tech startups that have completely collapsed. He has been falsifying your quarterly ledgers for the past 8 months to hide the deficit from your board of directors. You are not just broke, Valerie. Your company is technically insolvent." Valerie's eyes widened to an unnatural degree. She slowly turned her head to look at her son-in-law. "Connor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Is it true?" Connor swallowed hard, finally looking up. "Valerie, I can't explain," he stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "It was a bridge loan. The tech sector was booming. I was trying to double our working capital before the third quarter audit. The market just turned faster than I anticipated. I just needed a little more time to cover the margins. That is why we needed the cash from Tyrone's property sale. It was just a temporary patch." Valerie's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She lunged across the table, grabbing Connor by the lapels of his expensive suit. "You stole from me," she screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. You jeopardized my entire company for some reckless gamble. I trusted you. You are supposed to be managing my money. You are supposed to be family. I watched the chaos unfold with a detached, cold satisfaction. The empire of arrogance they had built was collapsing under the weight of their own greed. They had spent the last month trying to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my future, all to cover up a massive financial fraud committed by their own flesh and blood. I stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of my simple shirt. The movement drew their attention, stopping Valerie's tirade mid-sentence. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, frantic realization. She suddenly understood the true gravity of Jonathan's announcement. "You bought the debt," Valerie whispered, her voice barely audible. "You are my sole creditor." "That is correct, Valerie," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the quiet room. "I own every cent of your $5 million deficit. And unlike the banks you were hiding this from, I do not offer extensions, and I do not tolerate fraudulent ledgers." I leaned forward, placing both hands on the polished wood of the table, commanding the space completely. "You have exactly 7 days to make the first structured payment of $1 million. If the funds are not cleared into my holding account by the close of business next Friday, I will immediately initiate hostile liquidation proceedings. I will seize your commercial leases, auction your company assets, and file formal fraud charges against your chief financial officer with the federal authorities." Valerie stumbled backward, collapsing into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her. 7 days, she gasped. "Tyrone, that is impossible. You know we do not have that kind of liquid capital. Please, you cannot do this. We were supposed to be married. You said you loved me." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. "I loved the woman I thought you were, Valerie," I said coldly. "But the woman sitting across from me is a predator who tried to exploit an old man she thought was weak. You demanded I pay you rent to be your husband. You demanded I sell my home to fund your vanity. You told me you would not risk your future on me. I am simply returning the favor." I turned away from the table, not waiting for a response. Jonathan packed his briefcase, giving the stunned corporate lawyers one final dismissive glance before following me toward the heavy glass doors. Behind me, the conference room erupted into chaos. Valerie began screaming at Connor again, her voice shrill and hysterical, demanding to know exactly where every cent of her money had gone. Connor was shouting back, blaming the market, blaming the board, blaming everyone but himself. I pushed the glass doors open and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the law firm. The sound of their vicious infighting faded as the heavy doors swung shut behind me. The trap had been sprung, and the predators were now locked in a cage of their own making, tearing each other apart to survive. The fallout from the conference room did not take long to reach the rest of Valerie's parasitic family. I was sitting in my home office the next morning reviewing the legal transfer of the debt with Jonathan over a secure connection when my personal cell phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed Megan's name. I let it ring 3 times, enjoying the rhythmic vibration against my desk before I finally swiped to answer. I did not even get a chance to say hello. The moment the line connected, a loud, hysterical sob blasted through the speaker. Megan was crying so hard she could barely form coherent sentences. The arrogant, privileged woman who had sneered at my clothes and demanded I sell my house was completely gone. In her place was a frantic, hyperventilating mess. "Tyrone, please do not hang up on me," Megan wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of sheer panic. "Please, you have to listen to me. You have to stop this. Valerie just called us from the office." She was screaming. "She said you bought the debt and you are going to liquidate the company. Tell me it is a mistake, Tyrone. Tell me you are not going to destroy us." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out the window at the quiet street. "It is not a mistake, Megan," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of any warmth. "Valerie has a $5 million deficit, and I am collecting exactly what is owed to me within 7 days." The sound of Megan gasping for air filled the line, followed by a fresh wave of uncontrollable weeping. "You cannot do this to us," she shrieked, the panic escalating into absolute terror. "Tyrone, you do not understand what Connor did. He told Jameson the offshore tech investments were a guaranteed win. He showed us the projections and swore we would triple our money in 6 months. Jameson believed him. We all believed him." Megan's voice broke into a high-pitched whine as the reality of their financial ruin spilled out of her. "Jameson took out a second mortgage on our house to fund Connor's fake startups," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate stream. "He maxed out every single one of our premium credit cards. He even leveraged both of our luxury SUVs as collateral for a short-term bridge loan to help cover the company payroll last month. We poured every cent we had into Valerie's business because Connor promised the payout would secure our early retirement. If you liquidate that company next week, the banks will seize our home. They will repossess our cars. We will be left with absolutely nothing. We will be completely bankrupt. Megan was sobbing so violently I had to hold the phone an inch away from my ear. You have to forgive the debt, Tyrone, she begged, shedding all her remaining dignity. You have millions of dollars. You do not even need this money. Please, I am begging you. Do not take our home. We were just trying to support the family business. Jameson is having a panic attack in the living room right now. We cannot lose our lifestyle. We have social standings to maintain. You can punish Valerie and Connor, but please leave us out of it. Show us some mercy. I know we were harsh the other night, but we were just stressed about the wedding planning. We did not mean any of the things we said. You are a good man, Tyrone, a generous man. Please just sign a waiver releasing Jameson from the corporate liabilities. If you do not help us, we will be out on the street by the end of the month. She sounded like a drowning woman grasping at a razor-sharp life preserver, completely blind to the irony of asking for charity from the very man she had tried to leave destitute on the street. I listened to her pathetic pleas, but my heart remained entirely cold. My mind flashed back to the dinner table just a few days prior. I clearly remembered the vicious smirk on Megan's face as she adjusted her diamond necklace. I remembered the exact tone of her voice when she mocked my frayed flannel shirt and laughed at my average pension. I recalled how she stood on my front porch holding an iced coffee, pinching her nose in disgust as she called my home a moldy little shack and ordered a bulldozer to tear down my fence. She had looked at me as if I were a piece of garbage stuck to the bottom of her expensive designer shoes. Back then, she had zero empathy. She felt no mercy when she thought she was stripping an old man of his only asset to fund her extravagant lifestyle. I did not interrupt her crying. I waited until she ran out of breath and the line fell into a tense, sniffling silence. Megan? I began, my voice slicing through the phone line with surgical precision. Do you remember what you told me at the dinner table when Valerie dropped her prenuptial agreement in front of me? Megan whimpered clearly, unable to formulate a response. You told me it was just common sense. I continued speaking slowly so every word would land with maximum impact. You agreed with Valerie that she should not risk her financial future on a retired postal worker. You mocked my clothes. You mocked my home. You stood on my property and tried to forcefully bulldoze my land because you viewed my life as a stepping stone for your own greed. Megan let out a choked cry, realizing that her past cruelty had sealed her current fate. Tyrone, please, that was different, she pleaded weakly. No, Megan. It was not different at all, I stated with absolute finality. You wanted to play in the high-stakes corporate world. You wanted to leverage your home and your cars to fund fraudulent tech startups so you could maintain a fake image of wealth. You chose to trust a thief like Connor. You made a bad investment and now the market is correcting itself. I will not be waiving a single cent of the debt owed to my firm. My lawyers will initiate the liquidation proceedings on Friday at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. I suggest you spend your remaining time packing your belongings instead of calling me. Tyrone, no, please, Megan shrieked, her voice reaching a fever pitch of despair. But I was already done listening. Smart people do not risk their future on failures, Megan, I said, throwing her own arrogant logic right back in her face. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off her hysterical screaming instantly. The silence in my office returned peaceful and deeply satisfying. I set the phone face down on the desk and took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste. The first dominoes were falling, and they were taking the entire corrupt family down with them. But my moment of quiet reflection was interrupted by a loud, frantic pounding at my front door. It was not the authoritative knock of a delivery driver. It was the desperate, rapid banging of someone in serious trouble. I walked out of my office and moved down the hallway, glancing through the front window before turning the deadbolt. Standing on my front porch, completely stripped of his arrogant corporate posturing, was my son Deshaun. His designer tie was torn off. His shirt was wrinkled and his eyes were wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. Deshaun practically fell across the threshold. The arrogant corporate climber who had stood in my living room just days ago screaming that I was a pathetic loser was completely gone. He stumbled forward, his knees giving out as soon as he cleared the doorway. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor right at my feet. His expensive designer suit was covered in dust. His silk tie was ripped off and he was gasping for air as if he had run 10 miles. He looked up at me, his eyes red and wide with a level of primal fear I had never seen in him before. "Dad," he choked out his voice, a pathetic trembling rasp. "Dad, please, you have to help me. They are going to kill me." He grabbed the fabric of my pant legs, sobbing openly like a frightened child. I did not reach down to help him up. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had traded his own flesh and blood for the illusion of wealth and status. I waited for him to catch his breath and speak. I stared at his trembling hands clutching my pants. "Get up, Deshaun," I commanded, my voice firm and lacking any coddling warmth. "Be a man and tell me exactly what you did." He scrambled backward, pulling himself up using the edge of the hallway console table, but he could not stop shaking. It was Connor. Deshaun stammered, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve. "Connor told me the new tech initiative was a guaranteed gold mine. He said if I could just prove my worth to Valerie by securing a massive capital injection, they would make me a full partner. They promised me a seat on the executive board and a massive bonus. But the traditional banks turned me down because my credit was already stretched thin from buying the luxury car to keep up appearances. And then my trust fund, the emergency account I always relied on, it was completely frozen. I tried to access it, and the bank told me the primary signatory had locked it down." Deshaun choked back another sob, his panic bubbling over. I was desperate, Dad. I could not look like a failure in front of them. I could not let Valerie think I was useless. So I went to some people, unofficial people. I borrowed $1 million from a private lending syndicate downtown. Loan sharks. I clarified, my tone dropping to a dangerous register. You borrowed $1 million from violent criminals to impress a woman who treats you like an errand boy. Deshaun nodded frantically, his face pale with terror. I handed the cash directly to Connor last week, but then Valerie called me this morning screaming that the company is insolvent and that you bought their entire debt. The tech startup does not even exist. Connor used my money to pay off furious vendors and pocketed the rest. The money is gone, Dad. Completely gone. And the syndicate, they do not care about Connor or Valerie. They only care that my name is on the paper. 2 men showed up at my apartment an hour ago. They smashed my car windows and told me if I do not have their $1 million plus $200,000 in interest by Monday, they are going to break my legs and put me in a hospital permanently. They know where I live. They know where I work. I have absolutely nothing left. You are the only one who can fix this. You have hundreds of millions of dollars. You can pay them off with a single phone call. Please, Dad, you have to save my life. I looked at my son's terrified, tear-streaked face and my mind instantly drifted back 30 years. I remembered a bright summer afternoon in the park when Deshaun was 5 years old. I had taken the training wheels off his small blue bicycle. He was terrified of falling. He begged me to hold onto the seat forever, promising he would never learn if I let go. But I knew the absolute truth about gravity and growth. You have to experience the fall to understand the mechanics of balance. If I never let him scrape his knees on the pavement, he would spend his entire life relying on someone else to keep him upright. He had forgotten that lesson entirely. He had spent his adulthood leaning on my hidden trust fund, and then he tried to lean on Valerie's toxic empire. He never learned to balance his own life. I stepped back, putting distance between us. "I am not paying your debt, Deshaun," I stated with absolute unwavering clarity. His jaw dropped, his eyes bulging in disbelief. What he gasped, clutching his chest as if he had been shot. "Dad, they are going to kill me. You have the money. It is nothing to you. It is just a fraction of a percent of what you own. It is $1 million to save your own son. It is $1 million to save a man who refused to take responsibility for his own greed." I corrected him sharply, my voice echoing in the hallway. "You looked me in the eye and told me I was a pathetic loser. You disowned me in this very room because I would not drain my pension to fund your arrogant lifestyle. Now you want me to write a blank check to erase the consequences of your monumental stupidity. I will not do it." Deshaun began to hyperventilate, stumbling backward against the wall, clutching his hair. I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out a small, heavy piece of cardstock, and held it out to him. He stared at it, confused. "I am not giving you a handout," I continued, my voice steady and commanding, "but I am giving you a lifeline. That is the address to one of my commercial construction sites on the south side. You will report to the site foreman at 6 o'clock on Monday morning. You will haul, cement, carry steel, and work 12-hour shifts doing grueling manual labor. I will personally arrange a secure wage garnishment deal with your creditors. My private security detail will ensure the syndicate does not lay a single finger on you while you are actively paying them back. You will work off every single cent of that debt with your own two hands, no matter how many years it takes. You will learn the true value of a dollar, and you will learn what it means to actually build something from the ground up instead of begging for it. Deshaun stared at this card in my hand as if it were coated in poison. He looked from the address back to my face, his terror suddenly shifting back into that familiar entitled rage. I am an executive. He spat, his voice dripping with disgust and wounded pride. I have a master's degree in business. I am not going to break my back carrying cement like some uneducated day laborer. You are just trying to humiliate me exactly like you humiliated Valerie. He slapped the business card out of my hand. It fluttered to the hardwood floor between us. I would rather take my chances on the street than work as your glorified slave, he snarled. He turned around, threw open the broken front door and marched back to his damaged car, slamming the door shut and speeding away. I watched the dust settle in the street long after Deshaun's taillights disappeared. Before I could even turn away from the broken doorframe, a sleek black town car glided up to my curb. The rear passenger door swung open and out stepped Valerie. She wore a simple, uncharacteristically modest black trench coat, a stark contrast to the glittering emerald gown she had worn to the gala. Her perfectly styled hair hung loose around her shoulders, slightly disheveled to complete the tragic picture. She walked up my driveway with slow, hesitant steps, clutching a small designer handbag to her chest. As she reached the porch, she looked up at me with large, tear-filled eyes. Her mascara was subtly smudged, just enough to look devastated but still photogenic. Tyrone, she whispered, her voice trembling with a practiced, breathy vulnerability. Tyrone, please let me in. I am so entirely lost without you. Valerie did not wait for an invitation. She slipped past me into the hallway, wrapping her arms around my torso and burying her face against my chest. Her perfume, normally sharp and overpowering, was replaced by something softer, something designed to smell familiar and comforting. She looked up at me, letting a single flawless tear roll down her cheek. Tyrone, I have made a terrible mistake, she cried softly, her hand smoothing the fabric of my shirt. I was so blinded by the stress of running that company. The board of directors and the legal team, they were breathing down my neck constantly. You have to believe me. I never wanted that awful prenuptial agreement. My lead attorney forced my hand. He told me it was standard protocol to protect the shareholders, and I was just too exhausted to fight him. I never cared about your money, Tyrone. I only cared about us. I cared about the man who made me feel safe. She stepped closer, pressing her body against mine in a desperate, calculated attempt at seduction. She reached up, gently tracing the line of my jaw with her manicured fingers. We can fix this, she murmured, pitching her voice into a soft, intimate register. We can throw away all the contracts. We do not need Connor or Jameson or Megan. We can just be Tyrone and Valerie. I will fire my entire legal team tomorrow morning. We can start over with a completely clean slate. Just forgive the corporate debt, Tyrone. Let us merge our lives together the way we originally planned. You are a powerful, brilliant man, and I need a strong partner by my side. Imagine what we could build together. A true empire. Just call off the liquidation. Please, my love. I am begging you to give our future a real chance. I stood completely rigid, refusing to return her embrace. I let her play her part, watching the sheer desperation masking itself as affection. She was a master manipulator, twisting her body and her words to find a crack in my armor. She honestly believed that a few fake tears and a soft touch could erase weeks of blatant, vicious disrespect. She thought my heart was a vulnerability she could exploit to save her sinking ship. I gently but firmly grabbed Valerie by the wrists and stepped backward, physically detaching myself from her grasp. I walked over to the hallway console table, picking up a thick manila folder Jonathan had couriered to me earlier that morning. I did not say a word as I opened it and pulled out a stack of brightly printed emails. I held the papers up so the text was directly in her line of sight. Jonathan's private investigators are incredibly thorough. Valerie, I stated, my voice as cold as ice. These are internal communications between you, Connor, and a private medical facility located 3 states away. I read the highlighted text aloud. Once the wedding is finalized and the property deed is securely transferred to my holding company, we will initiate the medical power of attorney. We will claim his postal pension barely covers his needs and that he is showing severe signs of cognitive decline. The facility requires a 6-month minimum commitment, which is plenty of time to bulldoze the shack and finalize the commercial sale. I lowered the papers, locking eyes with her. You never wanted a husband. You wanted an elderly victim you could lock away in a nursing home while you liquidated his home. The manufactured tears dried up instantly. The soft, vulnerable posture evaporated, replaced by a rigid, trembling fury. Valerie's face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She snatched the emails from my hand, tearing the papers into jagged shreds and hurling them onto the hardwood floor. "You arrogant, deceitful old bastard," she shrieked, the volume of her voice rattling the broken doorframe. "You think you are so brilliant sitting on your mountain of hidden cash. You are nothing but a blue-collar fraud who got lucky with a few shipping contracts. You have zero class, zero pedigree, and zero right to judge me." She paced the hallway, waving her arms maniacally, completely losing any shred of her dignified corporate persona. "I built my company from the ground up," she screamed, spittle flying from her mouth. "I navigated boardrooms full of ruthless executives and I survived. Do you really think I was going to let a glorified mailman dictate my financial survival? You lived in this disgusting, moldy house looking like a homeless beggar. You practically invited someone to take your land. It was prime commercial real estate going to waste on a pathetic loser who did not even know how to wear a tailored suit. You should have been honored that a woman of my caliber even looked in your direction." She stepped aggressively toward me, her eyes bulging with manic rage. "You are going to cancel that debt liquidation, Tyrone. You are going to sign a waiver releasing my company from every single liability. If you think you can just swoop in and destroy my life's work, you are completely delusional. You are not a titan of industry. You are just a bitter, lonely old man trying to play a game you do not understand. I will ruin you. I will drag you through years of litigation until your logistics empire bleeds dry. You are nothing without me. You hear me. You are nothing." I simply stood my ground, watching the vicious, venomous creature thrash about in my hallway. This was the real Valerie. Stripped of her money, her lawyers, and her fake charm, she was nothing more than a desperate predator, furious that her prey had bitten back. Valerie pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face, her breathing heavy and erratic. "If you do not forgive that $5 million debt by tomorrow morning, I will go straight to the press," she threatened, her voice a venomous hiss. "I will tell the entire world that you are a ruthless, manipulative billionaire who preys on minority-owned businesses. I will destroy your reputation on every major news network. Your companies will face massive boycotts. You will be universally despised." I looked at the shredded paper on the floor, then back at her frantic, flushed face. "The media cannot save a bankrupt company, Valerie," I replied with absolute calm. "Your eviction notice arrives on Monday." I stepped forward, forcing her backward out of my house and onto the porch. Then I shut the heavy oak door in her face and engaged the deadbolt. By Tuesday morning, Valerie executed the exact threat she had screamed from my front porch. She did not go to a traditional news network. She went straight to social media, uploading a highly produced, meticulously edited video that went viral within hours. Sitting in a dimly lit room wearing a simple white blouse and minimal makeup, she looked like a woman pushed to the absolute brink. She stared directly into the camera, letting a single, perfectly timed tear roll down her cheek. She spun a masterclass in manipulation. She claimed that her minority-owned marketing firm, a company she built from nothing to empower voices of color, was the victim of a hostile, predatory takeover. She painted a picture of a shadowy, ruthless billionaire who had disguised himself as a humble, working-class man just to infiltrate her life, gain her trust, and systematically dismantle her life's work. She begged the public for support, claiming this malicious titan of industry was using aggressive legal loopholes to crush a self-made woman out of pure vindictive spite. The video ended with a plea to boycott my logistics companies, framing her financial ruin as an injustice against all small business owners. The digital reaction was instantaneous and fiercely aggressive. Valerie's video struck a chord with an online audience eager for a corporate villain to tear apart. Within 24 hours, the hashtag demanding justice for her company was trending globally. Meghan and Jameson amplified the campaign, sharing the video across all their networks, portraying themselves as collateral damage in a billionaire's cruel game. Financial news blogs picked up the story, running sensationalized headlines about the secretive logistics mogul who was bankrupting a female CEO just days before their planned wedding. My corporate offices received hundreds of angry phone calls, and a small group of protesters gathered outside one of my regional shipping hubs, holding cardboard signs demanding corporate accountability. A few of my minor short-term vendor contracts paused their negotiations, citing the sudden negative optics. The stock value of two of my publicly traded subsidiaries experienced a slight temporary dip. It was a localized storm, but the noise was deafening. Jonathan Miller arrived at my house late Wednesday afternoon looking unusually tense. He dropped his leather briefcase on my kitchen table and pulled out a stack of printed social media metrics and financial impact reports. "Tyrone, this is rapidly escalating from a minor nuisance into a legitimate public relations crisis," Jonathan warned, pacing across the hardwood floor. "Valerie is controlling the entire narrative. She has effectively weaponized her identity and her gender to shield herself from her own catastrophic financial failures. The public does not care about the $5 million debt she owes you. They only see a powerful man crushing a vulnerable woman. We cannot afford to let this fester." Jonathan stopped pacing and leaned over the table, his eyes locked onto mine. "We need to strike back, and we need to hit her incredibly hard. I have an aggressive crisis management firm on standby. We can release a counter-narrative within the hour. We can leak the details of her extravagant spending, her luxury vacations, and the predatory prenuptial agreement she tried to force you to sign. We can paint her as a gold digger who got caught in her own trap. We have to destroy her credibility in the court of public opinion before this localized boycott affects our long-term quarterly projections." Jonathan crossed his arms, waiting for my authorization to launch the character assassination campaign. I looked at the colorful charts and angry printed tweets spread across my kitchen table. I did not feel the slightest urge to defend myself against the opinions of strangers who knew absolutely nothing about my life. I picked up the papers, stacked them neatly, and handed them back to Jonathan. "We are not doing any of that, Jonathan," I stated with absolute unshakable calm. "We are not going to engage in a petty emotional mudslinging contest on the internet. I refuse to play the victim game, and I will not lower myself to Valerie's level by leaking personal gossip." Jonathan frowned, clearly frustrated by my lack of aggression. "But Tyrone, if we remain silent, the public will accept her lies as the absolute truth. The truth does not need a public relations campaign to validate it," I replied smoothly. "Valerie is using emotion to distract from the facts. We will use the facts to dismantle the emotion. I do not care what social media thinks of my character. I only care about the law. I want you to organize a press conference for tomorrow morning, but you will not mention our relationship, the wedding, or the prenuptial agreement." Thursday morning, the atmosphere in the downtown press club was electric. Dozens of reporters eager to cover the scandal of the ruthless billionaire packed into the brightly lit room, cameras flashing and microphones raised. I did not attend. I watched the live broadcast from the quiet comfort of my home office. Jonathan Miller stepped up to the podium looking every bit the formidable legal titan he was. He did not look angry or defensive. He looked entirely professional. He adjusted the microphones and looked directly into the cameras. "Good morning," Jonathan began, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the press. "Recently, serious allegations have been made regarding Vanguard Holdings, LLC, and our acquisition of a $5 million commercial debt. We are here today to provide complete, transparent clarity regarding this financial transaction." Jonathan did not bring up Valerie's tearful video. He did not mention the canceled wedding or the ruined tuxedo. Instead, he signaled to an assistant who distributed thick-bound dossiers to the front row of journalists. The debt acquired by my client was not the result of aggressive corporate maneuvering. Jonathan stated, his tone clinically precise. It was the direct result of massive systemic corporate fraud committed by the executive board of the debtor company. For the past 8 months, the chief financial officer Connor has engaged in severe financial misconduct. He illegally diverted millions of dollars of company capital into high-risk offshore accounts and deliberately falsified quarterly ledgers to hide these catastrophic losses from investors and employees. Furthermore, we have documentation proving that the chief executive officer, Valerie, was fully aware of this insolvency and actively sought to defraud private citizens of their real estate assets to cover up the embezzlement. Jonathan paused, allowing the reporters to flip through the heavily redacted yet damning financial ledgers provided in the dossiers. "My client does not engage in social media disputes," Jonathan concluded firmly. "We deal in verifiable facts. Therefore, rather than litigating this matter in the press, Vanguard Holdings has officially handed over all unredacted financial records, internal emails, and evidence of wire fraud directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for immediate criminal review." The press conference sent an immediate shockwave through the city, but the real climax occurred just 2 hours later. Local news helicopters were already circling Valerie's corporate headquarters, hoping to catch a statement from the embattled CEO. Instead, they broadcasted something far more devastating on live television. Half a dozen black federal vehicles abruptly surrounded the glass building. Heavily armed FBI agents wearing tactical windbreakers swarmed through the front doors carrying empty cardboard boxes to seize hard drives and physical ledgers. Within 15 minutes, the cameras captured the ultimate consequence of their arrogance. Connor, stripped of his smug superiority, was marched out the front doors in handcuffs, his head bowed in absolute disgrace. Valerie's carefully crafted narrative of victimhood completely evaporated in the face of federal indictments. While the federal agents were busy dismantling Valerie's corporate headquarters downtown, the catastrophic ripple effect of her financial ruin finally reached Jameson and Megan. The banks moved with ruthless efficiency. Without Connor's fraudulent bridge loans to artificially inflate their accounts, their creditors instantly foreclosed on their heavily leveraged mansion and repossessed both of their luxury SUVs. Within 48 hours of the press conference, the arrogant couple who had mocked my flannel shirt found themselves physically locked out of their own home with nowhere to go. Desperation quickly replaced their entitlement. With their credit cards declined and their wealthy friends suddenly refusing their phone calls, they resorted to a wildly criminal contingency plan. During the disastrous meeting at the law firm, Jameson had managed to memorize the address of one of my private vacation estates listed on the Schedule A asset declaration. It was a sprawling, secluded luxury cabin nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Believing the property would be empty during the week, they rented a cheap compact car with the last of their remaining cash and drove 3 hours north. Armed with a heavy steel crowbar, Jameson shattered the reinforced glass of the back patio door, granting them illegal entry into my private sanctuary. Once inside the expansive mountain estate, the harsh reality of their massive downfall fully settled in. Instead of feeling relief at finding shelter, their absolute powerlessness mutated into a destructive, childish rage. They were standing in a multi-million-dollar vacation home owned by the very man they had tried to casually discard. The sheer opulence of the property, from the vaulted timber ceilings to the custom stone fireplace, served as a glaring reminder of the massive wealth they could have shared if they had simply treated me with basic human respect. Megan dropped her bags on the pristine hardwood floor and immediately marched toward the custom climate-controlled wine cellar. She did not care that she was committing a major felony. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace toolset and violently smashed the glass door of the cellar, sending thick shards scattering across the floor. She blindly grabbed 3 bottles of vintage Bordeaux, each worth more than the cheap car they had rented to drive up the mountain. Jameson, completely unhinged by the loss of his corporate status and his impending bankruptcy, joined her in the destructive rampage. They popped the corks and began drinking directly from the bottles, pacing through the massive living room and fueling each other's toxic anger. They cursed Valerie for failing to secure my assets. They cursed Connor for gambling away their secure future. But most of all, they cursed me. They blamed me for their current homelessness, completely ignoring the fact that their own greed and reckless financial leveraging were the sole reasons they had lost everything. The alcohol quickly dissolved whatever tiny shred of rational thought they had left. Megan hurled a half-empty wine bottle across the room, watching it shatter violently against a custom-painted portrait hanging above the mantel. Dark red wine dripped down the pristine white walls, staining the expensive stonework. Jameson kicked over a solid oak coffee table, shattering the glass center, and began ripping throw pillows apart with his bare hands. They slashed the leather upholstery of the custom couches, screaming insults into the empty house as if I were standing right there. They actually believed that by vandalizing my private sanctuary, they were somehow reclaiming their lost power. They thought they could hide out in the mountains, drink my expensive wine, and punish me from afar without facing any real consequences. They had absolutely no idea that they were currently starring in a live broadcast, completely unaware that they had just triggered the silent, invisible security perimeter surrounding the entire property. I was sitting comfortably in my home office hundreds of miles away when my private server alerted me to the breach. My phone vibrated with a priority notification, immediately pulling up the high-definition, real-time security feed from the mountain estate. I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the crystal-clear footage of Jameson and Megan tearing my living room apart like feral animals. The high-tech audio sensors picked up every vicious curse word and every shattering piece of glass. I did not feel a single ounce of anger as I watched them ruin my expensive furniture. Their pathetic display of vandalism only cemented my absolute victory. They had reduced themselves to common criminals. I calmly picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct line for the local county sheriff's department. I identified myself as the property owner, provided the security access codes to the dispatcher, and reported an active violent home invasion in progress. Less than 20 minutes later, a fleet of county sheriff cruisers silently rolled up the long, winding driveway of the mountain estate. Their red and blue emergency lights cut sharply through the dark, dense forest, illuminating the shattered glass on the back patio. Through my live security feed, I watched as 6 heavily armed deputies took strategic tactical positions around the perimeter of the house. Jameson and Megan were so heavily intoxicated and consumed by their own destructive rampage that they did not even notice the police vehicles until the front door was forcefully kicked open by the lead deputy. The officers flooded into the destroyed living room with their weapons drawn, shouting clear commanding orders for the intruders to drop to the floor and show their hands. Jameson instantly froze, dropping a shattered vase and raising his trembling hands in the air. The reality of a heavily armed police tactical unit pointing weapons at his chest instantly evaporated his alcohol-induced courage. He dropped to his knees, whining and sobbing, completely surrendering to the arresting officers. Megan, however, had completely lost her grip on reality. The blinding privilege she had wielded her entire life convinced her that she was somehow above the law, immune to the consequences of a violent felony. When a deputy grabbed her arm to place her in handcuffs, she violently yanked herself away and began fighting the officer. She launched into a vile, hysterical tirade. As the deputies wrestled her to the hardwood floor, pinning her arms behind her back, Megan completely unleashed her true toxic nature. She screamed horrific, venomous racial slurs at the arresting deputies, her face contorted in absolute ugly fury. She demanded they release her, screaming that she was a wealthy, important woman and that they were nothing but worthless, uneducated public servants. She spat bigoted insults, degrading the officers based on the color of their skin and their working-class uniforms. She truly believed her perceived social status gave her the right to verbally abuse the very people arresting her for a major felony. She shrieked that she was going to have them all fired and their families ruined. The highly disciplined deputies did not entertain her unhinged meltdown for a second. They hauled Megan and Jameson up from the floor, securing the heavy steel handcuffs tightly around their wrists, and forcefully marched them out the front door. Megan continued screaming her racist vitriol all the way down the driveway, actively kicking at the doors of the patrol cruiser as they shoved her into the back seat. What Megan did not realize was that the lead deputy was wearing an active body camera that clearly captured every single racist slur she shouted. Within 24 hours, that specific footage was leaked to a major national news outlet. The raw video of the supposedly elite corporate wife violently attacking law enforcement with unapologetic racist insults went massively viral across all digital platforms. They had officially destroyed their own lives. The media circus surrounding the arrests of her family members was just the appetizer. The main course was the absolute financial death of Valerie's empire. With federal agents confiscating her servers and Connor sitting in a holding cell facing major fraud charges, her corporate facade completely collapsed. She had no more bridges to burn, no more illegal loans to secure, and no more lies to spin. Exactly 7 days after our explosive meeting at the law firm, Vanguard Holdings received the official legal notice. Valerie's marketing firm, once touted as a titan of industry, formally filed for bankruptcy. The paperwork was a surrender flag raised high over a burning castle. Her board of directors had completely abandoned her. Her investors were preparing massive class action lawsuits, and her accounts were entirely frozen. The $5 million debt my holding company owned was the heavy iron anchor that dragged her ship straight to the bottom of the ocean. 2 weeks later, the federal bankruptcy court was cold, sterile, and entirely devoid of the glamour Valerie usually demanded. I arrived early, wearing the same simple charcoal suit Connor had ruined with wine at the gala. I had replaced the shirt, of course, but the jacket remained a quiet reminder of their arrogance. I took a seat in the back row of the gallery, blending into the shadows of the heavy oak pews. I did not come to gloat or make a scene. I came to witness the final accounting. When the heavy double doors swung open, Valerie walked down the center aisle. The physical transformation was shocking. The untouchable, high-powered CEO who had demanded I sell my home to fund her vanity project was completely gone. In her place was a visibly aged, broken woman. Her posture, once rigid with superiority, was slumped and defeated. She wore a plain, unbranded dark blazer. Her hair lacked its usual salon-perfect volume, and the dark, heavy circles under her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights and endless panic. She looked 20 years older than the woman who had thrown that prenuptial agreement on my dining table. She took her place at the petitioner's table, flanked by a single, overworked public bankruptcy attorney. Her elite legal team from Sterling and Vanguard had dropped her the moment her retainer bounced. She stared blankly at the polished wood in front of her, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. She did not look back at the gallery. She did not know I was there. The presiding federal judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for corporate malfeasance, entered the courtroom and took his seat at the bench. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive stack of financial disclosures outlining the absolute wreckage of Valerie's company. The air in the room was heavy with finality. The judge did not mince words. He addressed Valerie directly, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, cutting through her remaining shreds of dignity. He outlined the gross negligence, the catastrophic mismanagement, and the sheer volume of unsecured debt she had allowed to accumulate under her watch. Valerie kept her eyes glued to the floor, nodding weakly as the judge systematically dismantled her life's work. She looked so incredibly small, stripped of her designer labels and her sycophantic followers. The illusion was dead. The reality of her actions had finally caught up to her, cornering her under the bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a federal courtroom. Sitting in the quiet gallery, I watched her crumble and felt a profound sense of clarity. There was no joy in my heart, only a solemn recognition of the destructive nature of unchecked greed. Valerie had built a life entirely on optics. She valued the appearance of wealth over the substance of character. She had treated people as disposable assets, measuring human worth strictly by bank balances and zip codes. Her ambition was a bottomless pit that demanded constant feeding, ultimately devouring her own family. She allowed Connor to gamble away her company. She allowed Jameson and Megan to float on a cloud of toxic entitlement. She had tried to devour me simply because she thought I was a weak, vulnerable target. If she had shown even a fraction of humility, if she had valued partnership over domination, she could have shared in an empire that would have secured her lineage for generations. Instead, her insatiable appetite for control had left her starving. Greed is a parasite. It convinces you that you are climbing a mountain right up until the very moment it pushes you off the cliff. The judge struck his gavel, bringing the proceedings to their inevitable conclusion. He looked directly at Valerie, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. Given the overwhelming evidence of financial insolvency and the staggering $5 million deficit owed to the primary creditor, Vanguard Holdings, this court rejects the petition for Chapter 11. Reorganization, the judge declared firmly. Your company lacks the operational capacity to restructure. Therefore, I am converting this case to a Chapter 7 total liquidation. Valerie let out a sharp, choked gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands as the remaining color drained from her face. The judge continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority, detailing the execution of the order. A court-appointed trustee will immediately seize all corporate assets, intellectual property, and vendor contracts to be sold. Furthermore, because you foolishly cross-collateralized your commercial bridge loans using your private real estate as a personal guarantee, your primary residence is hereby forfeited. The luxury mansion, your corporate vehicles, and all non-exempt personal assets will be seized and auctioned to satisfy the outstanding debt to Vanguard Holdings. You have exactly 48 hours to collect your personal clothing and vacate the premises. The gavel slammed down a second time. It was a sound of absolute, undeniable destruction. Valerie collapsed into her chair, openly weeping into her hands. Her assigned public defender packed his briefcase, offered a muted professional apology, and stepped away, leaving her entirely alone at the massive petitioner's table. She slowly turned around, scanning the empty courtroom, desperately looking for any friendly face in the gallery. That was when her tear-filled, panicked eyes met mine. I was sitting in the back row, perfectly still, watching her from the shadows. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She saw the man she had tried to charge, rent to the man whose house she had tried to bulldoze, now holding the legal deed to her own mansion. I did not smile. I did not sneer. I simply maintained eye contact, letting the heavy silence between us communicate the absolute finality of her defeat. Her entire empire was officially my property. Valerie was left with absolutely nothing. She had no company, no home, no luxury cars, and no wealthy friends left to bail her out. The high society status she had weaponized against me was completely erased by a single court order. She was now poorer than the retired postal worker she had so viciously mocked at her dinner table. She had tried to aggressively protect her future from me, and in doing so, she had handed me the keys to her entire life. I stood up from the wooden pew, adjusted my simple jacket, and walked out the heavy double doors of the courtroom. I stepped out into the bright Atlanta sunlight, breathing in the fresh air, leaving the ruined CEO to face her empty reality entirely alone. 2 days after the federal judge brought his heavy wooden gavel down on her entire existence, the dark sky over the city opened up and poured an unforgiving, freezing rain. Valerie had officially exhausted the strict 48 hours granted by the bankruptcy court to vacate her sprawling luxury estate. The bank executives had locked the massive wrought iron gates behind her, and the repo men had already towed her imported vehicles away. She had no corporate account to order a private car, and no wealthy friends willing to answer her desperate phone calls. They had all scattered like roaches the exact moment the federal agents raided her office. Now the former chief executive officer was walking down the side of a busy suburban road dragging a single scuffed rolling suitcase behind her. The expensive wheels of the luggage rattled harshly over the uneven pavement, catching on every crack and pebble. Her plain black blazer was soaked completely through, clinging to her shivering shoulders. Her designer shoes, utterly impractical for a 2-mile walk in a severe storm, were ruined, covered in mud and street grime. The freezing rain plastered her hair to her face, washing away the last traces of the polished, untouchable woman she had projected to the world. She was heading toward the only place she had left. Valerie finally turned onto my quiet, working-class street. The modest neighborhood she had once looked at with such profound vocal disgust now represented her absolute last chance at basic survival. As she approached my property line, her eyes darted toward the spot where the yellow bulldozer had parked just weeks prior. The chain-link fence she had ordered Jameson to tear down still stood perfectly intact, a silent monument to her monumental failure. She dragged her suitcase up the cracked concrete driveway, her ruined shoes squelching with every heavy, exhausted step. She stared at the single-story house she had viciously insulted, the place she had boldly called a moldy, rotting shack that was a complete embarrassment to her brand. Now that same small house looked like a desperately needed sanctuary. The cold rain was biting into her skin, and her immense pride had been entirely hollowed out by the brutal reality of bankruptcy. She had rehearsed her speech the entire agonizing walk over. She was prepared to throw herself at my feet. She was ready to cry, to beg, to offer me absolute submission if I would just let her sleep on my old sofa. She planned to tell me that the courts had taken everything, that Connor had destroyed her family, and that she finally realized I was the only honest, decent man she had ever known in her entire life. She was going to promise to cook my meals, clean the floors she once despised, and live a quiet, humble life by my side. She reached the wooden steps of the front porch, her hands numb and trembling from the freezing downpour. She dropped the handle of her suitcase and walked up to the heavy oak door. She raised her fist and knocked 3 times, the sound echoing dull and flat in the heavy rain. She waited, shivering violently, rehearsing her tearful apology one more time. When the door did not open immediately, panic began to set in. She knocked again, harder this time, her knuckles aching from the cold. "Tyrone," she called out, her voice cracking and pathetic, completely stripped of its former commanding tone. "Tyrone, please be home. I know I was wrong. I have nowhere else to go. Please open the door. I will do whatever you want. Just please let me inside." She leaned her forehead against the wet wood of the door, her shoulders shaking with genuine helpless sobs, entirely ready to trade whatever was left of her soul for a warm room. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly from the inside, sending a sudden jolt of desperate hope straight through Valerie's chest. She quickly wiped the rain and tears from her face, frantically trying to construct a look of pitiful remorse. The heavy oak door swung open, but the figure standing in the warm yellow light of the entryway was not the retired postal worker she had come to manipulate. Instead of my familiar face, Valerie found herself staring at a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, wearing a bright yellow high-visibility vest over a crisp, button-down shirt. He held a clipboard in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. He looked down at the soaked, shivering woman on the porch with an expression of mild professional confusion. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the stranger asked, his voice polite but entirely detached. "Are you looking for someone in the neighborhood?" Valerie froze, her mouth slightly open, the carefully rehearsed apology instantly dying in her throat. She looked past the stranger's shoulder, peering into the living room. The faded floral wallpaper was gone. The old comfortable furniture she had mocked was completely cleared out. The entire house was empty, stripped down to the bare wooden floorboards. Paint cans and construction materials were stacked neatly in the corner. "I am looking for Tyrone," Valerie stammered, her voice shaking violently as a new, profound terror began to take hold of her. "This is his house. He lives here. We were engaged. I need to speak with him immediately." The man adjusted his grip on the clipboard, his demeanor remaining strictly businesslike. "I am sorry, ma'am, but you are mistaken," he replied smoothly. "No one lives here anymore. I am the regional property manager for Vanguard Holdings. The previous owner, a Mr. Tyrone, vacated the premises over a week ago. He officially transferred the deed of this entire property to a philanthropic community trust." Valerie's eyes widened in absolute shock. "Transferred the deed," she gasped, wrapping her arms around her freezing torso. "What do you mean? He cannot just leave. Where did he go?" "I am afraid I do not have his forwarding address," the property manager stated, glancing down at his paperwork. "All I know is that the land was entirely liquidated. Mr. Tyrone directed all the proceeds from the commercial sale of this corner lot to fully fund a local trade school scholarship program for underprivileged minority youth. We are slated to demolish this structure on Monday morning to break ground on the new community center." The man offered her a small, sympathetic nod, completely unaware of the absolute devastation his words were inflicting. "So you see, ma'am, there is no one here to help you. The previous owner has completely moved on, and this is now an active construction site. For your own safety, I need to ask you to step off the porch and clear the property line. Have a good evening." The heavy oak door shut firmly in Valerie's face, the deadbolt locking with a sharp final click. She stood on the porch for a long moment, the freezing rain beating down on her back as the absolute reality of her situation crushed the breath from her lungs. I had not just taken her company and her mansion. I had completely erased my own footprint from her world, leaving her with absolutely nothing to grasp. She slowly turned around, walking down the wooden steps like a hollow ghost. She grabbed the handle of her suitcase and dragged it to the edge of the sidewalk. Her legs finally gave out. Valerie collapsed onto the wet concrete, burying her face in her hands, weeping completely alone in the freezing rain. Miles away from the collapsing corporate empires and ruined mansions, the scorching midday sun beat down relentlessly on a sprawling commercial construction site on the south side of the city. Deshaun wiped a thick layer of grit and sweat from his forehead using the back of his heavy canvas work glove. His entire body ached with a deep, bone-rattling exhaustion he had never experienced in his 35 years of life. His custom-tailored suits and silk ties were completely gone, replaced by a neon safety vest, steel-toed boots, and a hard hat that felt like it weighed 50 pounds. He hoisted another 80-pound bag of dry cement onto his bruised shoulder, his knees buckling slightly under the immense pressure. Every step across the uneven dirt terrain was a harsh, agonizing reminder of his monumental arrogance. He had scoffed at this very job just weeks ago, calling it slave labor and insisting he was too educated to break his back. Now, the blistering heat and the raw physical pain were rapidly burning away his toxic entitlement. He was no longer a junior executive playing a fake role in Valerie's fraudulent company. He was just a man trying to survive his own catastrophic mistakes. Deshaun dropped the heavy cement bag onto a massive wooden pallet, gasping for air as a cloud of gray dust plumed around him. Before he could even reach for his dented plastic water bottle, the sharp crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway caught his attention. A matte black luxury SUV bypassed the main security gate, ignoring the warning signs, and rolled aggressively onto the active construction site. The vehicle came to an abrupt, dusty halt exactly 30 yards from where Deshaun was standing. The tinted windows rolled down and the heavy custom doors swung open. Two massive, imposing men stepped out onto the dirt, dressed in dark, tactical clothing that clearly communicated their violent profession. These were not corporate debt collectors sending passive-aggressive emails. They were the brutal enforcers from the downtown lending syndicate, the men who had explicitly promised to break his legs if he did not produce their $1 million plus interest by Monday. Monday had already passed, and Deshaun was completely out of time. Deshaun felt his stomach drop completely into his boots. The blood rushed out of his face, leaving him cold despite the sweltering 100-degree heat. He instinctively took a step backward, his work boots dragging heavily in the dirt. He had no hidden trust fund to tap into. He had no fast-talking corporate lawyers to draft a settlement. He had absolutely zero leverage. The lead enforcer, a man with a thick, scarred neck and cold, dead eyes, locked his gaze directly onto Deshaun and began walking forward with deliberate, predatory strides. Deshaun's breath hitched in his throat. He looked around frantically for an escape route, but the construction site was a wide-open dirt lot surrounded by chain-link fencing. There was nowhere to run, and even if there was, he was entirely too exhausted to make it 10 feet. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He had borrowed dirty money to fund a fake tech startup because he wanted to look like a big shot. And the brutal reality of the criminal underworld had finally caught up to his foolish vanity. He closed his eyes, clenching his jaw and bracing his body for the violent beating he knew he entirely deserved. He prepared to pay the severe physical price for his massive, arrogant stupidity. "Hey, you two!" A loud, booming voice roared across the construction site, slicing through the heavy tension like a machete. Deshaun snapped his eyes open. The site foreman, a towering barrel-chested man named Griggs, stepped directly into the path of the advancing enforcers. Griggs was not alone. Within seconds, 4 highly trained, heavily armed private security contractors materialized from the shadows of the main scaffolding, moving with precise military coordination. They immediately formed a solid human barricade between Deshaun and the syndicate enforcers, their hands resting casually but dangerously close to their holstered sidearms. The lead enforcer stopped in his tracks, assessing the sudden tactical disadvantage. Griggs did not flinch. He pulled a thick, notarized legal document from his clipboard and shoved it directly into the enforcer's chest. "Read it carefully," Griggs commanded with absolute authority. "Vanguard Holdings has officially assumed financial mediation for this laborer. A strict ironclad wage garnishment protocol has been established and fully funded through a secured escrow account. You get exactly 20% of his weekly earnings transferred directly to your syndicate until the debt, including your exorbitant interest, is paid in full. If you lay a single finger on my worker, Vanguard Security will authorize lethal force, and our legal team will personally hand your entire underground operation over to the federal authorities." The lead enforcer scowled, ripping the document from Griggs's hand. He scanned the legal terminology, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the sheer, undeniable financial power backing the contract. The syndicate knew better than to wage a street war against a billionaire's private security force over a single bad loan. The enforcer crumpled the paper into his pocket, shot Deshaun one final venomous glare, and signaled his partner to back off. The 2 men retreated to their black SUV, slammed the doors shut, and sped off the construction site, kicking up a massive cloud of dust in their wake. Deshaun stood completely frozen, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He stared at Griggs, then at the heavily armed security contractors, who seamlessly melted back into their patrol routes around the perimeter. The profound reality of the situation washed over Deshaun like a tidal wave. His father had not abandoned him to die. Tyrone had absolutely refused to write a blank check to reward his son's arrogant greed, but he had secretly deployed his massive corporate resources to ensure Deshaun was shielded from physical violence. Tyrone had orchestrated a perfectly balanced intervention. He provided the necessary protection to keep the criminals at bay, but he left the crushing financial burden squarely on Deshaun's shoulders. The realization was incredibly humbling. For months, Deshaun had viewed his father as a weak, uneducated loser who lacked the ambition to succeed in the modern corporate world. He remembered kicking down Tyrone's front door, screaming insults and telling the man who raised him that he was worthless. He had proudly aligned himself with Valerie and Connor, admiring their flashy suits and fake wealth. Now Connor was sitting in a federal holding cell, and Valerie was a bankrupt, homeless outcast, begging in the rain. Meanwhile, the father he had so viciously disowned was quietly commanding an empire so vast and powerful that it could intimidate violent crime syndicates without breaking a sweat. Tyrone did not wield his wealth to boast, dominate, or destroy his own family. He used it to teach, to protect, and to enforce absolute accountability. Deshaun looked down at his blistered, calloused hands, wiping the thick cement dust from his palms. The anger and resentment that had poisoned his mind for months were completely eradicated, replaced by a deep, burning shame. He finally understood the massive difference between the shallow illusion of success and the quiet, unshakable power of genuine hard work. The path ahead of him was incredibly long. It would take years of grueling manual labor to pay off the massive debt he had foolishly incurred, but for the first time in his life, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He bent down, picked up his heavy steel shovel, and turned back toward the massive pile of dry cement. He had a massive financial debt to repay to the syndicate, but more importantly, he had a father's respect to earn back the hard way. Time moves differently when you are locked inside a federal penitentiary. For Connor, the former chief financial officer who once strutted through 5-star ballrooms in bespoke tuxedos, reality had shrunk to an 8x10 concrete cell. He was currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence for wire fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying corporate ledgers. The sheer weight of the federal indictment had crushed any hope of a plea deal that involved probation. The luxurious lifestyle he had stolen to maintain was completely gone, replaced by scratchy uniform jumpsuits and the metallic clang of cell doors. His personal life had deteriorated just as rapidly as his professional one. Megan, the woman who had happily spent the millions he illegally diverted, did not stand by her man when the FBI raided their lives. The moment the bank foreclosed on their mansion and repossessed their luxury cars, she filed for divorce. She cited irreconcilable differences and fraud, desperately trying to legally distance herself from the radioactive crater of his criminal convictions. Connor was left entirely alone, stripped of his title, his wife, and his freedom, surrounded only by the harsh, unrelenting consequences of his own monumental greed. I was sitting in my spacious home office enjoying a quiet Tuesday morning when my assistant brought in the day's mail. Mixed among the standard corporate reports and philanthropic trust updates was a cheap stamped envelope bearing the unmistakable return address of a federal correctional institution. I recognized the cramped, frantic handwriting immediately. It was from Connor. I used a sleek silver letter opener to slice through the cheap paper, unfolding the lined sheet inside. The contents of the letter were exactly as pathetic and self-serving as I expected them to be. Connor wasted no time dispensing with his former arrogance. The letter was a rambling, desperate plea for financial salvation and unearned forgiveness. He wrote page after page describing the horrifying conditions of federal prison, complaining about the food, the noise, and the sheer terror of being locked away with actual criminals. He practically begged me to intercede on his behalf. He asked if I could deploy my massive legal team to file an appeal or perhaps post a massive cash bond for a transfer to a minimum security facility. He promised that if I just wrote a check to secure a high-powered appellate lawyer, he would spend the rest of his life working to repay me. But the most revealing part of the letter was not his begging. It was his absolute refusal to take any genuine accountability. Connor dedicated 3 entire paragraphs to throwing Valerie entirely under the bus. He claimed that he was just a junior pawn in a much larger scheme and that Valerie had aggressively pressured him to cook the books to maintain her image. He painted himself as a victim of her manipulative corporate ambition, swearing that he never wanted to defraud anyone. He insisted that if Valerie had not demanded such an extravagant lifestyle, he never would have touched the offshore accounts. It was a cowardly, repulsive display of shifting the blame. He was asking the man he had viciously humiliated to save him from the woman he had actively conspired with. He genuinely believed that if he groveled hard enough and threw his former mother-in-law to the wolves, my deep pockets would magically open up and rescue him from his concrete cage. He wrote that he now realized I was the only truly honorable man he had ever met, heaping fake praise upon me in a desperate bid for sympathy. He claimed that sitting in his cell had given him a profound spiritual awakening, allowing him to see the error of his ways. The sheer hypocrisy was staggering. This was the exact same man who had laughed at my frayed collar and told me I was ruining the aesthetic of a corporate milestone. Now stripped of his stolen wealth, he was reduced to begging that same man for a multi-million-dollar legal lifeline. I finished reading the pathetic letter and let it drop onto the polished mahogany surface of my desk. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Instead, my eyes drifted toward a small custom-made acrylic frame sitting right next to my computer monitor. Encased perfectly inside the clear block was a crisp, neatly folded $20 bill. It was the exact same bill Connor had arrogantly flicked at my chest during Valerie's corporate gala, the money he had mockingly told me to use to buy a shirt from a discount rack after pouring red wine all over me. I had kept it. I framed it not as a reminder of the humiliation, but as a daily monument to the foolishness of arrogant men. That $20 bill represented the exact moment Connor believed he was untouchable. Looking at it now, the irony was absolute poetry. I refused to write him a new letter. He did not deserve the time or the effort it would take to draft a personalized response. Instead, I took a thick red marker from my pen cup and uncapped it. I flattened his rambling multi-page letter on my desk. I scanned through his pathetic paragraphs of begging and blame-shifting until I found a specific line where he claimed he needed my help to secure his future. With the red marker, I drew a heavy, unmistakable circle around the word future. Next to it, I wrote a single defining phrase in bold red letters: "Smart people do not risk their future on failures." It was the exact sentiment Valerie had weaponized against me at the dinner table, the very logic they had all used to justify trying to strip me of my home and my dignity. It was the perfect, undeniable response to his sudden demand for charity. I did not stop there. I walked over to the high-resolution scanner sitting in the corner of my office. I took the custom acrylic block holding Connor's $20 bill and placed it face down on the glass. I printed a crisp, full-color photocopy of the exact bill he had thrown at me. I took the photocopy and laid it on top of his heavily marked rejected letter. I folded the documents together, slipped them into a thick premium corporate envelope bearing the embossed gold logo of Vanguard Holdings, and sealed it shut. I did not include a check. I did not include a lawyer's business card. I simply returned his own arrogance back to him. I handed the sealed envelope to my assistant with explicit instructions to send it to the Federal Correctional Facility via certified priority mail. I wanted to ensure Connor had to sign for his absolute rejection in front of the prison guards. I wanted him to feel the exact weight of the delivery, knowing that the man he had mocked held his fate and chose to let him rot. 3 days later, mail call echoed down the dreary concrete cell block. Connor eagerly approached the steel bars, his heart hammering with desperate hope as the guard handed him the premium envelope bearing the Vanguard Holdings logo. He tore the seal apart, expecting to find a cashier's check or legal representation that would buy his freedom. Instead, he pulled out his own desperate letter, defaced by the bold red ink mocking his ruined future. Beneath it lay the full-color photocopy of the $20 bill he had once thrown in pure arrogance. The brutal realization hit him like a physical blow. There would be no rescue. There would be no mercy. Connor sank slowly onto his thin, uncomfortable cot, clutching the papers as he broke down into loud, uncontrollable sobs of absolute, total despair. 6 months passed since the collapse of Valerie's fraudulent empire and the day I handed my son a shovel instead of a check. The crisp autumn air swept through the city, carrying a profound sense of renewal. I was standing on the expansive wraparound balcony of my downtown penthouse, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee. The view from 40 stories up offered a sweeping panorama of the bustling metropolis below. I watched the tiny vehicles navigating the morning traffic, completely removed from the chaos of the streets. The modest house I had lived in for decades was now a fully funded community center, and my daily routine had shifted to managing my vast logistics network from this towering sanctuary. The quiet morning was a stark contrast to the screaming, the threats, and the frantic corporate destruction that had consumed the earlier part of the year. I took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze fill my lungs. The intercom on the wall chimed softly, breaking the absolute silence of my private sanctuary. My head of security announced that I had a scheduled visitor waiting in the lobby. I gave the authorization to send him up, my heart beating with a quiet, steady anticipation. The private elevator doors slid open with a soft, metallic hum, stepping directly into the main foyer of my penthouse. Deshaun walked out, and the physical transformation he had undergone in just 6 months was nothing short of staggering. The arrogant, slick corporate climber who used to wear suffocating designer suits and expensive cologne was completely gone. The man standing in my foyer wore a clean, simple flannel shirt, durable denim work pants, and scuffed steel-toed boots. His shoulders were broader, heavily muscled from hauling raw cement and steel beams under the brutal southern sun. His hands, once soft and manicured for typing emails and shaking hands at lavish galas, were deeply calloused, scarred, and stained with the permanent grit of hard manual labor. He looked rougher, weathered by the elements, and physically exhausted. But more importantly, his eyes were entirely clear. The frantic, desperate panic of a man drowning in loan shark debt had evaporated. The toxic entitlement that Valerie and Connor had fed him was completely flushed from his system. He stood tall, projecting a quiet, grounded confidence that only comes from surviving the absolute bottom. Deshaun did not strut into the room or demand attention. He waited respectfully in the entryway until I turned around from the balcony glass doors. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice deep, steady, and devoid of any lingering resentment. He walked over to the massive glass coffee table in the center of the living room and reached into his heavy canvas jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick, tightly banded stack of $100 bills alongside a crumpled, heavily stamped legal document. He placed the cash and the paper directly on the glass surface. "That is the final installment," Deshaun stated, his tone carrying a profound sense of accomplishment. "The foreman signed off on the transfer this morning. The syndicate debt is completely paid in full. Every single cent of the principal and the interest has been cleared. The money on the table is the leftover wage garnishment from my last 2 shifts. I wanted to bring it to you personally to prove the ledger is closed." I looked down at the physical proof of his grueling 6-month ordeal. He had worked double shifts, weekends, and holidays, breaking his back in the dirt to erase the monumental mistake he had made trying to buy the approval of fraudulent elites. He told me how the site foreman Griggs had worked him to the bone, refusing to give him a single second of special treatment. He detailed the agonizing muscle cramps and the brutal heat, explaining how every drop of sweat felt like a necessary payment to wash away his past arrogance. I stepped away from the balcony and walked toward the center of the room, looking intently at the man standing before me. I did not see the foolish boy who had kicked down my front door and called me a pathetic loser. I did not see the desperate victim begging for $1 million bailout to save his fragile ego. I saw the exact man I had always hoped my son would eventually become. I saw a man who understood the crushing weight of accountability and the priceless value of an honest day of grueling work. The crucible of the construction site had burned away his arrogance and forged a spine of solid steel in its place. He had faced the terrifying consequences of his own monumental greed and chose to dig himself out of the hole with his own 2 bare hands. He did not run. He did not point fingers or blame circumstances. He took the heavy shovel I offered him and did the excruciating work required to reclaim his own life. The overwhelming pride I felt in that specific moment was stronger than any corporate acquisition I had ever finalized. I reached out, bypassing the money on the table, and firmly gripped Deshaun by the shoulders. I pulled him forward into a strong, unwavering embrace. It was the first time I had hugged my son since the day he threw his life away for a seat at Valerie's table. He returned the embrace immediately, his broad, calloused hands gripping my back with genuine, respectful affection. There were no tears, only the solid mutual understanding between 2 men who had weathered a massive storm and survived. "I am incredibly proud of you, Deshaun," I said, stepping back and looking him squarely in the eyes. "You paid a very high price for your education, but you learned the lesson perfectly." Deshaun nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through his hardened exterior. "Thank you for not writing that check, Dad," he replied softly. "If you had bailed me out, I would have ended up exactly like Connor, sitting in a federal cell blaming the entire world for my own failures. You saved my life by making me save myself." I walked over to my desk and picked up a sleek, silver-embossed folder. I brought it back and handed it to Deshaun. "I told you I would never fund your mistakes, but I also promised I would always support your legitimate growth," I explained as he opened the folder. Inside is an employment contract for Vanguard Logistics. It is an entry-level management position at our primary distribution hub. You will be managing freight schedules and overseeing the loading docks. The salary is modest and the hours are incredibly demanding. You will start at the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder and you will report to a regional director who does not care what your last name is. If you want a corner office, you will have to earn it by proving your operational value every single day. Deshaun stared at the contract, his eyes scanning the strict employment terms. He looked up at me, his expression radiating absolute profound gratitude. He did not ask for a higher title or a bigger salary. "I will take it," he said firmly, reaching for a pen. Deshaun signed the employment contract without a single moment of hesitation. He handed the folder back to me, shaking my hand with a grip that spoke volumes about his new character. The toxic rift that had nearly destroyed our family was completely repaired. The poison of unearned privilege had been entirely flushed from our lives. Our relationship was no longer infected by the arrogant expectations of high society or the shallow pursuit of fake wealth. The bloodline was officially healed, reconstructed from the ground up on a foundation of mutual respect, brutal accountability, and genuine hard work. I watched my son walk back toward the private elevator, knowing he was finally ready to carry the immense weight of the empire I would one day leave behind. A few weeks after Deshaun signed his employment contract, Jonathan Miller arrived at my penthouse with the final stack of legal paperwork. The heavy leather briefcase he carried seemed lighter than usual, reflecting the absolute closure of the chaotic chapter that had consumed the latter half of the year. Jonathan laid the crisp, notarized documents on my glass coffee table, outlining the final liquidation of Valerie's corporate assets and the permanent transfer of her remaining real estate holdings to Vanguard. The bankruptcy courts had officially processed the last of the creditor claims, effectively erasing her entire empire from the financial ledgers. Furthermore, the federal prosecutors had formally secured Connor's guilty plea, ensuring his lengthy prison sentence was ironclad without the possibility of an early appeal. Jonathan poured himself a cup of coffee, looking at the finalized documents with a deep sense of professional satisfaction. "The dust has completely settled," Tyrone Jonathan stated, closing his empty briefcase with a decisive click. "The corporate debt is fully resolved, the criminal convictions are secured, and your personal assets remain entirely untouchable. The legal extraction is completely finished. I signed the final acknowledgement forms, effectively closing the book on the most toxic relationship of my entire life. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a drive. I bypassed the sleek, armored corporate vehicles parked in the underground garage of my penthouse building and instead opted for my old, reliable pickup truck. The faded paint and the familiar hum of the aging engine provided a comforting contrast to the high-stakes corporate warfare I had been navigating. I drove through the bustling downtown districts, eventually winding my way out toward the quieter working-class suburbs where I had originally built my life. The weather was unusually clear, the bright sunlight reflecting off the polished hoods of the passing cars. I merged onto a familiar commercial stretch, deciding to pull over at a large, bustling convenience store and gas station to top off my tank. I parked the truck next to one of the pumps, swiped my credit card, and stood leaning against the rusty fender as the gasoline flowed. I glanced through the large floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the convenience store, casually observing the afternoon rush of customers buying sodas and lottery tickets. That was when I saw her. Standing behind the main register wearing a brightly colored, ill-fitting polyester uniform shirt and a plastic name tag was Valerie. The sheer shock of the visual contrast momentarily froze me in place. The woman who had once stood in a glittering emerald gown at a corporate gala demanding that I sell my home to fund her vanity was now mechanically scanning barcodes for minimum wage. Her hair, which used to be styled with absolute precision by expensive salon professionals, was pulled back into a simple, severe ponytail. The heavy designer makeup was completely gone, revealing the deep, exhausted lines etched into her face by months of relentless stress and monumental failure. She was ringing up a customer who was loudly complaining about the price of a pack of cigarettes. Valerie did not argue back or assert her dominance. She simply kept her head down, apologizing in a quiet, defeated voice, completely stripped of her former arrogant authority. I watched her hand the customer his exact change. Her shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of her new reality. She was no longer the untouchable CEO operating from a glass corner office. She was simply a woman trying to survive the catastrophic wreckage of her own monumental greed. I stood by my truck, the gas pump clicking off automatically, but I did not immediately reach for the nozzle. I continued to watch her through the glass. She grabbed a spray bottle of cheap industrial cleaner and a ragged cloth, walking around to the front of the counter. She began scrubbing a sticky soda spill off the linoleum surface, her movements slow, repetitive, and utterly devoid of pride. A few months ago, she had sneered at my worn flannel shirt and called my home a moldy shack. Now she was physically cleaning up the messes of strangers just to afford her next meal. The irony was absolute, a perfect symmetrical display of cosmic justice. I expected to feel a surge of triumphant joy, a deep vindictive satisfaction at seeing the architect of my near destruction brought so incredibly low. I expected to want to walk through those sliding glass doors, buy a pack of gum, and drop a $20 bill on the counter, just to watch her recognize the man she had so viciously tried to discard. I wanted to see the exact moment the humiliation registered in her eyes. But as I watched her scrub the counter looking so incredibly small and broken, I realized I felt absolutely nothing. There was no joy, no anger, and certainly no desire for revenge. I only felt a quiet, profound acceptance of karma. She had built her entire life on the fragile illusion of superiority, and the universe had simply rebalanced the scales. I did not walk into the convenience store. I did not need to gloat or parade my victory in front of her. The need to prove my dominance was a symptom of a fragile ego, a weakness that Valerie had suffered from, but one that I refused to entertain. True power does not require an audience. I had already won the war the exact moment I signed that prenuptial agreement. Everything that followed was simply the natural consequence of her own predatory actions. I reached out, pulled the gas nozzle from my truck, and returned it to the pump with a solid clunk. I screwed the gas cap back on, securing it tightly. I opened the heavy metal door of my truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I put the truck in gear and slowly merged back onto the busy suburban road, driving away from the convenience store without casting a single backward glance toward the glass windows. I drove back toward the towering skyline of the city, the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the pavement. I thought about the massive empire I commanded from the shadows, the logistics fleets moving goods across the continent, and the commercial properties generating immense sustainable wealth. I thought about my son Deshaun, who was currently breaking his back on a construction site, slowly earning his way back to honor and respect. But mostly I thought about the profound lesson I had learned over the past 6 months. True wealth is not measured by the balance in your offshore accounts, the square footage of your penthouse, or the designer labels stitched into your clothes. True wealth is the absolute, unshakable freedom to walk away from toxic, manipulative people and never look back. It is the power to protect your peace, maintain your dignity, and let the universe handle the rest. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged stronger. My empire secure, and my bloodline healed. The silent adjustment was complete. Looking back on the wreckage of the empire Valerie tried to build and the rebirth of my own son, there is another profound lesson embedded in this entire ordeal. We live in a society that constantly confuses volume with value and equates flashy displays of excess with genuine stability. Valerie Connor and Megan wore their supposed wealth like a suit of armor. They used their designer labels, luxury vehicles, and elite corporate titles to intimidate anyone they deemed beneath them. They looked at my frayed flannel shirt and my modest home, and they immediately calculated my worth as zero. They believed that because my life was quiet, my life was small. That is the greatest danger of unchecked arrogance. When you operate from a place of superficial superiority, you develop a massive and fatal blind spot. You stop assessing the actual substance of the people around you and start believing your own manufactured illusions. If Valerie had possessed even a single ounce of humility, she might have paused to wonder why a retired postal worker was so completely unbothered by her aggressive legal threats. If she had treated me with basic human decency, she would have gained a loyal partner and access to a fortune that could have secured her lineage for generations. Instead, her relentless need to dominate and humiliate blinded her to the reality that she was trying to extort a man who owned the very ground she walked on. The tactical advantage of silence cannot be overstated. When people insult you, try to belittle your achievements, or mock your humble lifestyle, your first instinct is often to defend yourself. You want to shout your accomplishments from the rooftops to prove them wrong, but reacting with anger only hands your power over to your enemies. By remaining perfectly still and keeping my mouth shut, I allowed their massive egos to dictate their actions. I gave them exactly enough rope to hang themselves. True strength does not need to announce its presence in a crowded room. It simply waits for the right moment to act. This also extends to how we love and protect our own family. With Deshaun, I had to learn the agonizing difference between enabling a loved one and empowering them. Handing him $1 million to pay off violent criminals would have saved his life in the short term, but it would have permanently destroyed his character. True love sometimes requires you to watch someone you care about hit rock bottom so they can learn how to climb back up. The moment you tie your self-worth to the brands you wear or the car you drive, you become a slave to a fragile image. The people who truly build lasting legacies are those who operate with quiet conviction. They find their validation in the peace of a quiet morning and the knowledge that their foundation is built on solid rock. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that true wealth is found in character and respect, and share your own experiences in the comments below.